August 1944, Ukraine. A German Panzer commander is watching Soviet armor move through a tree line 3 miles east of his position. He's watching through binoculars, and he's not shooting. He's taking notes. The Soviet column isn't bunching up. It isn't waiting for orders from the rear. The tanks are moving in coordinated bounds, one element holding while another advances, exactly the way German doctrine said to do it. Artillery is shifting ahead of the armor without being called. The infantry is keeping pace, not getting cut down in the open. German after-action reports from this period contain assessments that would have been unthinkable 3 years earlier. Commanders noting in plain language that Soviet formations were conducting operations the Wehrmacht would have been proud of. That should stop you cold, because this is 1944. 3 years earlier, German divisions had destroyed entire Soviet armies in an afternoon. The Red Army of 1941 walked into encirclements. It couldn't coordinate artillery with armor. Its officers froze when communications broke down, because showing initiative could get you executed. So what happened between 1941 and 1944? The Wehrmacht kept winning battles, and it still lost the war. And the reason those two things are both true is the most important thing most people don't understand about the Eastern Front. Subscribe if you want history that doesn't sanitize the uncomfortable parts. This is that channel. Here's the question to carry through this whole video. If the Wehrmacht had better kill ratios, better tactical doctrine, better trained officers, and beat the Red Army in engagement after engagement all the way to 1945, how did it lose to an army it kept defeating? The popular answers are numbers, Lend-Lease, weather. Those answers aren't wrong, but they're incomplete, and what they miss is more interesting than any of them. Let's give the Wehrmacht its due, because it deserves it, and because the argument only works if we're honest about how good it actually was. The kill ratios on the Eastern Front are not propaganda. In the early war years, German forces inflicted casualties at ratios military historians still find staggering, destroying Soviet forces many times their own size in engagement after engagement, with a consistency that had no precedent in modern warfare. At Kharkov in 1943, Manstein's counterattack recaptured a major city in roughly 4 weeks against a Soviet force that outnumbered him, with kill ratios analysts still study as near textbook. Even as the war turned, German tactical performance remained formidable. But there's a caveat worth knowing before we go further. Post-war analysis shows that German tank kill claims were often 2 to 3 times higher than actual Soviet losses. German gunners frequently claimed kills on armor that Soviet maintenance crews recovered and returned to action within 48 hours. The Wehrmacht's tactical edge was real. It was also consistently overstated by the Germans themselves in the heat of battle. The Germans had Auftragstaktik, mission-based command doctrine. Officers at every level were expected to use initiative without waiting for orders. In the early war years, this was embedded more deeply at junior officer and NCO level than in any other army in the world. They had superior crew coordination inside their tanks, a professionalized NCO corps built over a decade, a command culture that rewarded aggressive independent action at every level. So when people say the Wehrmacht was the best tactical army of the Second World War, they are not wrong. The evidence is overwhelming. But there's a problem with that argument, and it's been sitting in plain sight the whole time. The Wehrmacht won almost every tactical engagement on the Eastern Front from 1941 to 1945, and it still surrendered in Berlin, with Soviet flags on the Reichstag. Tactical excellence didn't save it. The question is why. To understand what happened, you need to understand exactly how bad the Red Army was at the start, and why. Stalin's purges of 1937 and 1938 had gutted the officer corps at precisely the moment military doctrine was becoming more complex. Approximately 35,000 officers were removed, killed, imprisoned, or dismissed. 3 of 5 marshals, 13 of 15 army commanders, roughly half of all corps and division commanders. The desperate need for talent eventually forced the regime to reinstate nearly 11,000 of them by 1941. But the damage was done. The men who replaced the purged officers were promoted years ahead of their experience, leading formations they didn't understand, under a command culture that had been broken from the top down. Soviet officers in 1941 were terrified of showing initiative. Initiative could be interpreted as deviation from orders. Deviation from orders could be interpreted as sabotage. Sabotage meant the NKVD, so they waited. They asked for permission. They reported optimistically upward, not because they were deluded, but because filing accurate bad news was dangerous. Commanders were making decisions based on a picture of the front that bore almost no relationship to reality. The gap between what was actually happening at the front and what Soviet commanders believed was happening could be 24 hours wide. In mobile warfare, 24 hours is the difference between an organized defense and an encirclement. So they died in encirclements because nobody had authorized a retreat, and nobody would authorize one without permission that never came in time. 1941 cost the Red Army somewhere between 4 and 5 million casualties, killed, wounded, and captured in the first 6 months alone. Prisoners alone numbered over 3 million by December. By the end of the year, the original Red Army that had existed before Barbarossa was, for practical purposes, gone. What replaced it is the story most people miss entirely. Here is the thing about destroying an army. If the country survives, it gets to build another one. And if it's ruthless about learning from what went wrong, the Second Army doesn't make the same mistakes. The Soviet Union in 1941 and 1942 was learning at a pace that had no precedent in military history, because the cost of not learning was immediate and catastrophic. Every mistake that got an army encircled, every coordination failure that left tanks unsupported, all of it fed directly back into training, doctrine, and command selection. The Wehrmacht was also learning, but it was learning how to fight the Red Army it had faced in 1941, and that army no longer existed. The transformation wasn't clean. 1942 was still catastrophic. The Second Shock Army's destruction, the fall of Sevastopol, the collapse at Kharkov in May that opened the road to Stalingrad. These were the failures of an army still mid-transformation, still carrying the institutional scars of the purges, still working out how to translate lessons into practice at scale. But 3 things were changing simultaneously that would matter enormously by 1943. The first was command culture. In late 1942, Stalin made a decision that gets almost no attention in popular history. He abolished the commissar system. He stripped political officers of their veto over military decisions and restored unity of command to professional soldiers. From that point, a general could issue an order without a party official countersigning it. This sounds administrative. It wasn't. It was the prerequisite for everything that followed. Stavka began systematically identifying officers who performed and removing those who didn't. Zhukov, Rokossovsky, Vasilevsky, Konev. These men weren't products of political favor. They were products of a brutal meritocracy with one criterion: results. Rokossovsky had survived the purges by luck, spending nearly 3 years in NKVD custody. Torture, mock executions, broken fingers. He was released, handed command of an army, and reportedly carried a pistol for the rest of his life, vowing he would never be taken alive by his own government again. He became one of the finest operational commanders of the entire war. The system that had nearly destroyed him had, in the most brutal possible way, taught him what institutional failure looked like from the inside. The second was the replacement pipeline. Germany's manpower system was a bureaucratic disaster. Replacements went to depots rather than to units. Experienced formations bled out at the front, while fresh troops sat in rear areas waiting for administrative processing. The German military tradition valued elite status so highly that commanders would rather form a new division, prestigious, well-equipped on paper, than send those same men as replacements to a veteran unit that actually needed them. The cumulative effect amounted to multiple divisions lost annually. Not to enemy fire, to organizational failure. The Soviets solved this differently. Destroyed units were reconstituted around a core of survivors who carried institutional knowledge, then rebuilt. Brutal for individuals, but it distributed hard-won experience through new formations instead of letting it disappear with depleted units. The third was logistics, and here American industry changed the war. Nearly 400,000 trucks gave Soviet armies mobility they couldn't have sustained otherwise. Soviet soldiers revered the Studebaker US-6 so much they nicknamed it the Studer, and used it as the primary chassis for the Katyusha rocket launcher. American industrial output and Soviet firepower fused into a single vehicle. Meanwhile, of the roughly 150 divisions that had invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, only 19 were armored and 15 motorized. The remaining 80% moved on foot, horses for artillery, horses for supplies. By 1944, that gap had become a chasm. The Red Army was becoming the most mobile force on the continent. The Wehrmacht was regressing toward the 19th century. Trucks don't teach officers how to coordinate armor with artillery, but they gave the institution that had learned how to do it the operational reach to execute at a scale Germany could no longer match. Here's where we are. The Wehrmacht was tactically elite throughout the war. The Red Army rebuilt itself into a fundamentally different institution between 1941 and 1944. Both things are true, but here's the implication most analyses stop short of. By 1944, the Soviets had learned to use the Wehrmacht's tactical excellence against it. German doctrine depended on speed, hitting a gap before the enemy could respond, exploiting penetrations before reserves arrived, keeping the opponent permanently off balance. It worked brilliantly against an army that couldn't process information fast enough to respond. It worked less well against an army that could. The difference between 1941 and 1944 wasn't that the Soviets stopped taking catastrophic losses. It was that they had built an institution that could absorb those losses and keep advancing. The Germans called Bagration a catastrophe without precedent. In 6 weeks, Army Group Center suffered losses comparable to Stalingrad. But unlike Stalingrad, no propaganda apparatus could reframe it as heroic sacrifice. The front simply ceased to exist. It happened while Normandy was dominating Western attention. Most people still don't know what it was. So why did the Wehrmacht lose to an army it kept defeating? Because tactical victory and strategic survival are not the same thing, and the Wehrmacht was optimized entirely for one of them. German military doctrine from Moltke through Schlieffen through Blitzkrieg had been built around the decisive engagement, the battle that ended the campaign. It worked in France in 1940 because France broke. It worked in Poland because Poland broke. The entire system assumed an enemy that would stop functioning when it suffered enough tactical defeats. The Soviet Union did not break, and the Wehrmacht had no answer for an enemy that absorbed catastrophic losses, learned from them, and rebuilt faster than Germany could adapt. It didn't help that the Wehrmacht's greatest institutional advantage was being quietly destroyed from above. As Hitler appointed himself commander-in-chief of the army and began personally managing division movements. The decentralized initiative that had won France and nearly won Russia was being dismantled by the same regime it served. By 1944, Germany had become a political autocracy pretending to run a military technocracy. The Soviet Union had made the opposite journey. The Wehrmacht was one of the finest tactical fighting forces in military history. It lost to an army that understood something it didn't. That in a war of this scale, the institution that learns fastest wins. Not the institution that fights best today. The institution that fights better tomorrow. Here's the uncomfortable truth this whole video has been building toward. The Wehrmacht's tactical brilliance wasn't a path to victory. By 1943, it was a trap. Keeping Germany in a war it couldn't sustain. Burning irreplaceable experienced soldiers in engagements the Soviet system could absorb. And Germany's couldn't. An army that is excellent at fighting the battle in front of it, but has no system for surviving the war around it, is not actually a great army. It's a great weapon with no strategy for how to use it. The Wehrmacht maintained better kill ratios than the Red Army from the first day of Barbarossa to the last day in Berlin. Every time the two armies met in the field, Germany killed more Soviets than it lost. Does that mean the Wehrmacht was the better army, and Germany simply lost to a superior economic and political machine it was never going to beat regardless of how well it fought? Or does an army that couldn't survive the war it was actually in, no matter how well it fought individual battles, prove that tactical excellence without strategic sustainability isn't military greatness at all? Drop your answer below. Like this video if this changed how you think about what makes an army actually good. Subscribe. We go deep every week, and thanks for watching.